Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Pamela Morales. I'm the Communications Officer for the Museum of South Texas History. Welcome to our Sunday Speaker Series online. Today's presentation is Contextualizing George Floyd, a South Texas Perspective. This is a panel discussion. We will have several presenters and they will be moderated by Francisco Guajardo. He is the museum's CEO. So without further ado, let's go ahead and have the presentation start. Before Francisco goes ahead and starts the presentation, I do want to remind everybody you are encouraged to leave comments and questions on the Facebook Live. It is up to the discretion of the moderator to address any questions or comments, and if there is time, we will have a Q&A afterwards. So as I mentioned, Francisco, if you would like, please go ahead and start the presentation.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you to the entire community and really the world, because now we do work with the world. You know, this is just the kind of life that we live in, the world that we are, I think, enveloped in. So the talk today is really about making sense ourselves as people who live in South Texas, who care about the South Texas community, and who also care about the history of this place. This is an opportunity, I think, that that we had to seize on to make sense of what's happening, not only in this country, but I think as we've seen during the last couple of days, a real explosion of emotion and expression across the globe. And so I think that from our perspective as a museum of history, that we feel that we have the responsibility to be part of the conversation, because we do not live in isolation. I think that for many years we have thought that South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley has been kind of an isolated place. I mean, in some ways we have geographically, maybe in some ways we have as well in terms of, you know, flow of ideas in and out, but we know that we live in a very different day and a very different environment. And so there's much greater fluidity. The world has actually shrunk, metaphorically speaking. And so because of all of that, it's really our responsibility to engage our community in a conversation on what's happening today. So I would like to introduce you to three panelists today, all of whom, by the way, have been part of the museum's Sunday Speaker Series through the years. And if I can just speak a little bit to the Sunday Speaker Series, this is a Sunday Speaker Series that in the last maybe 4 or 5 years has really gained some good traction. You know, under the leadership of Rene Ballesteros and Pam Morales as well. We do 2 of these per month and have been now for some years. But the Sunday Speaker Series, even before it was very regular, we have evidence of in the 70s, when historians like Hubert Miller from the university were giving talks on regional history, South Texas history. So there's a long kind of narrative of doing this. We're doing it differently now, obviously. And we welcome that opportunity. So today we have 3 historians, 3 educators, and 3 people who care deeply about the Valley. And so we have Dr. Beverly Friday, who has for many years been engaged as a serious researcher and educator in the Valley. We have Dr. Alberto Rodriguez, who is a local as well and is a professor and associate professor of history at Texas A&M University in Kingsville. And we have Roseann Bacha-Garza, who is also a historian and anthropologist. All 3 of our panelists today, and Roseann, by the way, is a professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. All 3 have taken a deep dive into not only local and regional history, but also the history of African Americans in our community. So we think that they obviously have a lot to say, and they've had a lot to say through the years. So we wanted to bring them together today to help us and to help our community make sense of what's happening today. And do we have any kind of connection to this macro narrative? So I would like to begin by just posing one question of, how is it, Beverly, that you're making sense of what's happening today? We'll begin with you, and then we'll kind of go, you know, around the circle to get your take on how you're making sense of what's happening, not only with George Floyd, but George Floyd is part of a broader narrative in our country's history, and even I think in global history.
Well, I think it's important for us to note that enough is enough. And I'm reminded, and that's of a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King that states, to ignore evil is to become an accomplice to it. And I condemn in the strongest positive term what's happening in Minneapolis and any racially motivated violence. Why? Because when we have our citizens, especially the African American community, that have died over many years through the hands of police and others, what's happening today is, of course, we mourn the death of George Floyd. We're with his family and friends, but it's appalling. But guess what? The only difference in now and over 400 years is the camera. Because living as an African American person, we deal with it daily and every day. So now the world gets a chance to see what we feel and act and live and breathe every day. We are in a situation where often we can't breathe through institution, through housing, through education. Every aspect of our lives, where most people find it very normal to be in a world that the average person accepts you and the perception of who you are as a human, and the Constitution supports us being equal. But however, the perception of those that we live with and work with on a daily life does not. I think it is appalling. It follows this horrible slaying, not only of George Floyd, but there's Breonna Taylor that was fatally shot by police in Louisville on March the 13th. There's Ahmaud Arbery, fatally shot by a former Glenn County, Georgia police officer on February the 23rd. And I can go on and on and on and on and on and on, and we don't have enough time for me to go on and on and on. So please know that this evidence is overwhelming, that people of color, African American, minority, Hispanics has been dying for years. So what we're saying that no more, and it's not just a political issue or a shooting issue, it's a systemic racist and racism issue. And until we deal with that, we're going to be in trouble. The act of killing Mr. Floyd and other African Americans, if that makes you feel uncomfortable, then good, it should. And what are you doing about it? Well, guess what? Today, we're doing something about it. We're not being complacent. We're not being an accomplice to it. We're speaking out. And I'm happy to support all of the protests that have happened throughout the United States, as well as in the Rio Grande Valley. Our commitment should be never, ever, ever, ever to become complacent or accepting of this evil against anyone, not just African American, but anyone. We have a responsibility, and I want to charge every one of us to identify and denounce racism and hatred and intolerance and any type of violence wherever you see it. If you don't speak up, then guess what? And you ignore it, you become an accomplice. So don't be an accomplice today or any day. I think it's important that we're all here, and Roseann is going to make sure Bacha-Garza is going to add her comments, because we're all in support of the idea that it is appalling of what's happening in the world we live in today. Roseann?
Thank you, Beverly. As Roseann unmutes herself, I also just want to speak as part of a bridge between the two of you that you know, I hear your emotion, Dr. Friday, and thank you for that. I think that's an important component of this. The other important component, I think, from a museum perspective, And my name, by the way, is Francisco Guajardo, and as the CEO of the museum, you know, I see it as a very important responsibility to broach the issue, to allow the community to be part of a conversation where we can have this kind of dialogue in a non-threatening way, because it is very emotional, it is potentially very combustible as well. So I think that we welcome both the emotion to be expressed, and we welcome as well the contextualization of it. So how does this happen? What does it mean? What does it mean to us? So Roseann, we welcome your observations now. And thank you, Beverly.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I've been researching Rio Grande Valley history since I moved here in 2005. I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in New Jersey. I married a Mexican-American man while I was still living there. And then in 2005, we relocated down here to South Texas. And ever since then, ever since I arrived here, I've just been very intrigued by the fascinating history of the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And when I embarked upon a master's degree in history here at UTRGV, ever since then, I've continued the research and the passion, and I found so many fascinating and interesting stories. And a large part of my focus on the history of the several interesting towns and municipalities in Hidalgo County and beyond, and the established ranches along the Rio Grande. Valley historians that have gone before me have urged and inspired me to research further the history, in particular, of the Jackson Ranch and the Weber ranches, because of the fact that they are of mixed race origins. So these two ranches, each founded by a white man and his emancipated slave wife. And then these two families had several mixed race children. And upon their arrival here in the early to mid 1850s, they established their ranches, they bought land, and they eventually melded into the Tejano culture that was predominant in the region. And so what I feel is relevant to today's discussion is the aspect of identity of the descendants of these families that we find here in the Rio Grande Valley. People of African descent have been coming to this region for centuries. You know, back when Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca and Estebanito, like Francisco Guajardo is very knowledgeable about. You know, Estebanito was a black slave. They passed through this region. Another century after that, there was a shipwreck of Spanish soldiers and black slaves along the Rio Grande near a location in Cameron County that we call Los Indios. And in Martin Salinas' book, they talk about this group of Native Americans as Los Negros because, you know, they were melding into the community even way back when. Jose de Escandon recognized these cultures when the Spanish land grantees were here in the mid 1700s. And then in the mid 1800s, when these mixed race families arrived on the border, the newly established border between the US and Mexico, feeling pushed out of their homelands, the Webers from Austin, the Jacksons from Alabama, they just wanted to come to a region where they could live in peace and harmony with their family and sustain on the land, plant crops, ranch cattle, sell their wares and their excess food at their licensed ferry landings along the Rio Grande. So these families arrived in the the early to mid 1850s, but they have eventually completely assimilated into the Tejano culture. And today, when you find these family members, the descendants of these families in today's culture, they completely identify themselves as Tejanos or Mexican American, often speaking Spanish first in the home. And so, but yet they have this African American background. So what I think is important to talk about in today's discussion is how the folks here, and there are many folks who may not even realize here in the Rio Grande Valley that they have this African American descent in their makeup, and how this blending of races has really created a very unique and special community, and one that we all can be proud of. And so we have to, in light of these events, turn the lens in upon onto ourselves, recognize who we are as people, and try to affect change and be proud of who we are, and to you know, participate in these protests, but with a purpose, and lead with a task. You know, don't just participate and go home and do nothing. You know, look into these very interesting and intriguing little tidbits of history that we call ourselves in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. We have a lot to be proud of here. We're a very unique community. And even though in the past, like both who spoke before me have said, yes, we are sort of on an island down here, but that doesn't have to be a detriment. You know, we can shake our pom-poms and tout our accomplishments and really be proud of who we are as a community. And so, you know, this is why I have really rolled up my sleeves and delved into this this research, so I could build my knowledge on who these people were when they arrived here, and how they've assimilated and evolved through time, and you know, what we are producing today as Rio Grande Valley citizens.
Thank you, Roseann. Appreciate those observations. So, Dr. Rodriguez, you know, Roseann makes reference to Estebanico, you know, when Cabeza de Vaca walked through here sometime between 1528 and 1536. And so he brought a black slave with him. We know that Luis de Carvajal was importing slaves, you know, sometime in the late 1500s, late 16th century. And so when Escandon brings his people in the mid 1700s, one of the observations is that, oh, there are black people living here, right? And so this is not something new. This is actually something that's quite historical. And so your line of research actually shows also, or has explored some of that. And so that can be a second question for you. The first one, I think, Alberto, is really how you feel at the moment, you know, as you observe the national and global kind of milieu.
Sure, thank you for having me. You know, I at first angry, frustrated, you know, because as a historian, I mean, I remember the King, the Rodney King in Los Angeles. And as I became an academic, there was opportunities for us to come together as a coalition between Black and Brown under Reyes Lopez Tequirina, and then Jesse Jackson, Rainbow Coalition, NAACP, LULAC. And it's frustrating that we've had these opportunities and we've never haven't taken fully advantage of them, you know. And as a father of a 15-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl, it's tough answering these questions of like, why did that person get killed? I go, because, you know, because he was Black, you know, and because this doesn't happen to other people normally. I mean, there's a history of this. And then I'm asking me questions, what could that happen to us? And as a parent, it's frustrating. It's making them understand that this is a legacy of systemic racism. You know, I have them read the new Jim Crow. I have them sort of, the other day I set them down and they both saw Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. that sort of really talks about this in the 80s, and we're talking about now 2020, and we're still having these issues. So I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated, that we move forward one step and three steps back. I'm frustrated that people aren't having these conversations enough like we are having today. And I always strive my students and my kids and my wife to put themselves in situations they're not comfortable with, because that's going to have them grow as individual. Go and talk to an African American you see at Starbucks, and ask them. Just have a conversation. They might think you're crazy, but I mean, it's nice to sort of just see what they're going through, and just try to understand some of these situations. So in doing that, after a while, I sort of I get down and I write. I write, and I teach my kids, and I write not only my immediate family, but my university kids, and I have them write, and I have them think about the situation, their privilege as people in higher ed, their privilege as upper class, middle class students, white students, African students, African American students, and Latinos, and sort of really think about ethnicity. I don't deal with race because I feel that's a social construct, but ethnicity and how we see not only differences, but how we're alike. I give the example of corn tortillas, cornbread, chitlins, menudo, barbacoa, brisket, all this sort of stuff that sort of is sort of linked us together. But at the beginning, frustrate, anger, then the idea of having to educate. There's never and show that there's a history. This doesn't just pop up and it just happened. And we look at the King situation, we go further back, double V campaigns of the 40s, the induction of NAACP. We look at W.D. Du Bois's work. Frederick Douglass. There is a legacy here that has been moving towards equality and has never been able to get there, and why that is. And so we have those difficult conversations. But none of this is going to happen if we don't ask ourselves and check our privilege at the door. And I have to check my privilege at the door too, as being an academic. I was a migrant farm worker. I'm no longer a migrant farm worker. I'm an academic. So I have to check my privilege and say, you know what? I have a different perspective. I grew up in the Valley all my life. I left the Valley. I came back. I sort of understand, and I have to really check my privilege as a Latino in South Texas as a majority. Am I part of the problem? And if I am, how am I going to fix that? Have those difficult questions. So that's how I feel right now. Frustrated, angry. But when I get over it, I write, I teach, I do things like this. And that leaves for me a legacy that some people can go back to later. We talked earlier about the legacy of our university, A&I Kingsville. And I think that that's something that I'm proud of. And I have to put myself also in these situations that I'm not comfortable. I'm going to have to grow as a person, as an individual. And I really want other people to do that. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. So
Alberto, let me go back to you and begin, circle going the other way. So thank you, first of all, for your observations. I'm struck by your notion of race and how, you don't necessarily, teach in terms of race or even maybe, do analysis of the world, but rather ethnicity, you say. And so, and that's a highly complex situation, right? I mean, we know from the scholarship that even somebody like George Sanchez, who was a great activist and educator, professor up at the University of Texas in the 40s and 50s and 60s, that he preferred that Mexican-American children be seen as white. Because if they were seen as white, then they would not be subject to the laws, whether they be laws that were de jure or de facto, of what the Black children were subjected to, right? And so for George I. Sanchez, it was convenient to frame it in that way. If I can have all those children in my population group be seen as white, they can have greater privilege. And in fact, I think that even you, Alberto, you will recognize, like I can tell you that me, growing up in Elsa, Edcal Chosa, that I remember my first grade teacher saying that I was güerito. And I remember how I was able to curry favor with her because I was a light-skinned Mexican kid. that mattered. It mattered for my teacher, and I think it mattered to me, and it mattered to the other children in the classroom. It did something, right? It did something to my psyche. And it also did something to my classmates who did not curry that kind of favor because they were not light skinned. You know, it matters. I remember when my first child was born, my father said, "Ah, mira, está güerito." My father said that. My father, who was very dark skinned, and he felt he was punished, you know, for it for many, many years. And so it's a highly complex issue, Alberto. Can you speak to that as a historian who also studies these kinds of things? And especially because I think that when we live in the Valley, we know that we live in a beautiful environment, a beautiful society, right? We sort of come together across races, you know, across groups, immigrant groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're actually, I mean, we are in a place of privilege here, you know, where people kind of look after each other, you know, white people, Mexican people. And I would even say that even in the midst of segregation through the years, that I remember Melissa Dotson Betts putting down money for the Echo Hotel in 1959. What is that about? The Black teacher at the George Washington Carver School, she felt something about doing something with the community. So it's highly complex. And so I think, Alberto, if you can speak to that and then move into this whole issue of what's the context here? Because we know that there was slavery, Black slavery, just like Native American slavery in northern Mexico, in the mines, in the 1500s and the 1600s. And some of those Black people actually came to the river. And so when Escandón comes and he says, oh my God, 1751, there are Black people here. You know, where were they from? Right? So speak to that a little bit, offer context, and then also speak to the complexity of this whole issue of race and ethnicity.
Sure. Like I said, there's my work sort of starts where Roseann's begins, and I go all the way to present. But there's these waves of Black settlement. I don't even want to call it migration because it's settlement. I mean, there was Black people in the Rio Grande Valley before there was Tejanos. Let me get that clear, okay? And the idea of race and the idea of colorism and the idea of being categorized comes from the Spanish. They had at one point over 50 different castes, but you have Escandón, it comes 1750. Our next wave comes with what Roseann was sort of talking about with these what I call old timer Blacks that sort of settle in the rural areas, Donna, Texas. We have a couple in Cameron County. What is Cameron County? And tied in with that, you have the Underground Railroad. We have documentation from WPA that Black folks came to Brownsville, they came to Matamoros. If you're a slave in Houston, you're not going to run to New York. You're going to run south, where Mexico had done away with them. We have beautiful 6 or 7 slave narratives that talk about coming to this area. We have one man that actually talks about falling in love with a Mexicana in the Laguna Seca Ranch outside of Edinburgh. When he's interviewed. He also later on becomes part of the Texas Ranger Party, which is very controversial. We can talk about later.
Alberto, let me interrupt you there. What you're talking about, I had no idea existed. What do you mean there's slave narrative 6 or 7 of free people? Where can we find that?
I've already published an article. I'll send it to you. But it's in the WPA. In the WPA there's Brownsville, there's actually most slave narratives are about 3 or 4 pages. Ben Kenchler, the man I'm talking about, has 2. One is actually 25 pages, and it was about 5. I did a piece already I can send to you with the Journal of South Texas that talks about this. And they're actually talking about going to Mexico and having their kids learn to speak Mexican. They don't say Spanish.
Wow. So Alberto, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your reference to the WPA is that during the Great Depression, as part of the New Deal legislation, there were a number of scholars who became employed to conduct oral histories on former slaves. Correct. In the 1930s. So a lot of slaves were elderly. Go ahead.
So let me give you the example of Ben Kenchler, who is very unique, and I think that says a lot to what the Valley and how we look at ethnicity and race. Ben Kenchler comes from what we know Hays County right now, around the Houston area. He's actually shipped here with his mom as a 1-year-old because the slave master impregnated his slave, and she is actually made to sort of leave the plantation. Lives in Brownsville, she marries a Mexicano, and Ben Kenchler is raised by this Mexicano. He talks about how he would play around with Mexicanos and they would hunt food and stuff together. Later on, he goes and works as a cowboy at Laguna Seca Ranch, which is a ranch outside of Edinburgh. Very, very popular, especially for immigrant families, where my family came from. Francisco doesn't know this, but my family is actually from La Villa and Head Couch. So I have ties from that area. My grandpa came there and then moved to La Villa. And he falls in love with a woman, a Mexicana woman. Talks about how he courts her and how the dad allows it, and then later on becomes part of the Texas Rangers sort of scouting. We have others that talk about putting hay bales into the water crossing. We have others that said that the Mexicans were so nice that they allowed their ferries to be untied and allowed the boats to go to Mexico. We have accounts of Sam Houston going to Matamoros and finding two of his former slaves in Matamoros. And so that's something that hasn't really been talked about enough. I was a talking head in one of Roseann's films that she could talk about that we had. And then we have Roseann's migration of the people that settled there. And then one migration in between that we sort of really don't talk about a lot is the Black military in Fort Brown, Fort Ringgold, and Fort McIntosh. And this is really important because it's the first time that the Southern states see Black armed men that are part of the American government. And that really checks their privilege at the door. Texas Rangers are running rampant in South Texas at the same time. And here are Black troops with guns that have federal jurisdiction. And then we have the migration of the 1920s, 1910s, as a railroad comes in, and Edinburgh has a Black population, a Black community. Raymondville, Brownsville, Harlingen, Brownsville, McAllen, all sort of have these segregated Black communities. And then we have an out migration that happens after the Brown case. And like I said earlier, in recent years, since about 1995, 2000, we've had a migration of African Americans from the old Rust Belt cities, Ohio, Indiana, coming as professionals, teachers, lawyers, professors settling in the valley. So it constantly moves, right? And then let me allude a little bit to what's going on the opposite of that. We also have Black folks that are coming from Mexico and the Caribbean to the border, that are moving to areas like Matamoros and Reynosa and then across sometimes. And that's something that I've sort of moved over to a little bit, looking at the Black presence in Mexico through comics like the Mean Penguin, blackface movies like Angelitos Negros, and the Cuban influence, Tomasa La Negra, Celia Cruz, who are actually instrumental in sort of bringing mambo and salsa to Mexico and Latin America. So it's a beautiful thing, and the idea it's to some extent it's a chain migration. At the same time, it's just a settlement that keeps on shifting, and it's like I think Beverly talked about it. Like they helped build this community and they held it together. So I always felt before there was a Tejano, before there was a Carvajal, before there was a Cavazos, a Guerra, Palacios, there was a Black man or a Black woman on the mouth of the Rio Grande. And it's something that we really sort of need to unpack.
Thank you, Alberto. Appreciate that. So just for the audience, I'd like to sort of let you know about the rhythm of this. So we began with Dr. Friday because we wanted to get her observation first and then moved around. And so then as we finished that round, then we began with the history with Dr. Rodriguez because he's the one who has studied more the colonial period. And we're moving back around. And so Professor Bacha-Garza will now be, I think will be on the spot here. So Roseann, your observations on your own research, and then Dr. Friday will be moving to you. And so you will kind of, bring up the last part, which is 20th century, which is where your line of inquiry has been, but you understand much more, of course. So Roseann, if you can speak also to your research with the 19th century references that Alberto actually made.
Well, yes. As part of the CHAPS program here at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, we have embarked on this really wonderful project called the Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail project. It is a multi-layered, multifaceted, never-ending, continually growing project. And we had pulled in several scholars to assist us with the development of this project. There's one who, Dr. Jim Leiker, who was instrumental in writing a chapter in this book about the African American military experience in the Rio Grande Valley during and then after the US Civil War. And Steve McBride out of Kentucky talked about, the military folks coming down, mustering into the 114th, 116th, 117th units of US color troops that served on the border. And but my particular area of expertise is again, these mixed race families that settled along the Rio Grande before the US Civil War started, before Texas became a Confederate state. So as the Webbers are feeling pushed out of the Austin area as we approach 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act is in existence, and more folks are moving into the Austin region and populating what started out as Austin's 300s in the early 1820s. Now by 1850 we've got a heavier population who's not so kind and accepting of any of these mixed race unions. And the two families that I'm researching, the Jacksons and the Webbers, both consist of a white man creating a union with a black slave. Weber himself, when he moved to the Austin region and got his land grant over there, met and fell in love with the neighbor's slave, Sylvia Hector, and was only able to procure her freedom and the freedom of their three children after they had three children together. They continued to live there and enjoy life there until it got more populated and their kids weren't allowed to go to school, and they felt that they had to leave. So they headed for the newly formed U.S.-Mexico border. After the Mexican-American War, the Rio Grande became the natural and international border between the U.S. and Mexico. And Weber had a lot of experience traveling in the region and knew where to go. And Jackson, same, was a plantation owner in Alabama, and his relationship with Matilda Hicks was a loving and family-like relationship as well. So these are not stories of plantation owners or angry white men having illicit relationships with these slaves, and then a children is produced and then the man ignores the child. No, these were loving family relationships. And as they are feeling pushed out of their region of the world, of the region of the United States at the time, because of hostile feelings toward folks of African American descent or mixed race unions, they're feeling pushed down toward Mexico. And keep in mind, Mexico at the time, 1821, Mexico became Mexico. They got their independence from Spain, and right off the bat, they were not interested in slavery in Mexico. And finally, in 1829, with the second president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, he abolished slavery. So that was 1829. These families are coming down in the early to mid 1850s. Mexico had abolished slavery already for a few decades and were enticing Black families with offers of free land to settle in Mexico. But these two particular families stopped at the river. And they decided to stay on the US side of on the banks of the Rio Grande. And then, you know, they built their communities, and then they integrated into the culture. So, you know, like I said in the beginning, I'm from the New York City metropolitan area. It's a melting pot society up there. You have, you know, the Italian American sections of the region. You have Irish American, Puerto Rican American. You have all different neighborhoods where people who come off the boat and into our country through Ellis Island and those other Castle Gardens up there are moving toward neighborhoods where they find people that are like them. Well, these two families come down, and there are some people like them, but they decided to really integrate and assimilate into the community here. So, and they were being elected as officials in the, you know, the Hidalgo County government and commissioner's court, and they were business owners. And in fact, one of the slides that I have talks about the El Capote Ranch, which is what Nathaniel Jackson purchased when he got here in 1857. This particular clip from one of the newspapers down here after the turn of the 20th century mentions the Jackson Ranch as a ranch that grew up out of a settlement of runaway slaves, and they intermarried with Mexican and Indians. Eli Jackson, who was one of the sons of Nathaniel Jackson, you know, he had a prominent place in the Hidalgo County Commissioner's Court, and he was clearly half white and half black. So back then, you know, they're not this black or half black or mixed race community, however you want to label it, is not really separating themselves from society. They are welcoming and moving into and assimilating and learning the language and loving the people, and helping out their neighbors. And so they, the Jacksons and the Webbers, were an integral part of the Underground Railroad that was, well, we call it the Underground Railroad, but that's just the activity of fugitive slaves leaving southern states and northern Texas and wanting to find their freedom in Mexico. So these families had licensed ferry landings on their ranches, and they gladly assisted folks over the river. And in some cases, and if you look at the US Census during that period of time, you'll see that some of these runaway slaves decided to stay and not go into Mexico and meld into these two neighborhoods, these two communities along the river, because they felt comfortable, they felt welcomed, and they felt, you know, safe. So if you look at the census during that period of time, you would see in the section that has your race, it'll say, you know, a certain name from South Carolina or Louisiana or whatnot, and the race is B for black. And so, and then it's listed on a Jackson Ranch census from, you know, 1870, 1880, 1890. So these families were instrumental in, you know, assisting fugitive or runaway slaves to go across the river into Mexico, or harboring them in their communities and assisting in their subsistence and success along the Rio Grande. So what's interesting about these two families, again, is the fact that, well, I even shouldn't even say it's interesting. They just came here, they melded into the community, they were elected into the county commissioner's court and as elected officials, and they were not, it seems, through what I can find in the research, that they were accepted for who they were. And then Nathaniel Jackson's son, Eli, had a son who he named Nathaniel after his father. And if, I don't know, Renee, if you did put up the image of Polo Jackson, that's the Jackson Ranch Church. This is Nathaniel Polo Jackson. So he's the grandson of Nathaniel Jackson, the founder of the ranch. And you know, the picture is a little blurry, but this man has African-American blood. And he was a jailer. He was the jailer at the jail at the where we have the Museum of South Texas History today. He was present at the first hanging of somebody in the jail in 1912. And then if you go to the next slide, there's an article in the newspaper, in the Brownsville Herald, labeling this man as a far Negro found killed in a canal nearby his property, apparently because he refused to sell property. So as time goes on and you have you know, a bunch of different groups coming in, you know, things were getting a little bit complicated. So, you know, the Jacksons were very religious people. And they built this is not the church they built in 1857, or even it's been renovated several times, but this is the Jackson Ranch Church. It was the first Methodist church down here in the Rio Grande Valley, and they have their own cemetery there. And Martin Jackson, who was one of the sons of Nathaniel Jackson, it was in the first slide that we had. That's the oldest picture of a initial descendant that came down here. And then this is the Eli Jackson Cemetery, which is adjacent to the levee right now. It's a few hundred feet down the road from the church. And Nathaniel Jackson is buried in here in an unmarked grave. But these families had, when they came here in 5 covered wagons in 1857, they had with them family members who were married into other families like the Singletaries. And then the Brewsters came after they arrived on this scene after the Jacksons got here. And then this image is the Weber Cemetery, which is still operated by family descendants today. And John Ferdinand Weber is buried in here, and his descendants as well. And Weber has a military headstone in this cemetery because he was in the War of 1812. But the point is, with all of this research, is that, you know, as you can see, there are still some identifying phenotypically recognizable issues with some of the family members as time goes on to identify themselves that, oh yes, this person is definitely of African American descent. And up until, you know, the 1920s, 1930s, the people here in the Rio Grande Valley, whether they were thinking about it or not, were identifying this area or these 2 ranches as Negro settlements. But then as time went on and they continued to intermarry into the community, and they start now to, their descendants, but their last names are Flores and Ramirez and Bravo. But yet they tie back to this family. And today, in today's culture here, these families recognize themselves as Mexican American. And they often speak Spanish first in the home, or they speak Spanish at home with their grandparents and great-grandparents. And they truly believe themselves, and that's where how they identify themselves. But what's interesting, especially about, and what makes this family, these two families and their peripheral families so special, is that they really do have a blending of all three of the biological races within their makeup. And so as we move along in world culture, I read an article back in the 1980s that talked about by 2050, we're going to be all beige. You know, we're going to all be so mixed that we're going to be, you know, it's not going to be able to tell. So I guess my point is, and I don't want to take up too much more time, is that I really think that, you know, everybody needs to take some time to really understand who they are and where they come from and be proud of it. And then, you know, take action as to not participate in, you know, derogatory sayings and discrimination and, you know, holding people back. That's why people are protesting right now. You know, take a stand, be strong, and recognize who and what you are and be proud of it.
Thank you, Roseann. I appreciate the context and the you know, historical observations and notes. So, Dr. Friday, as I go to you, I would like to posit a couple of like historical strands here. One of them is, I think, an assist from one of our viewers who mentions a very compelling field of thought, Afro Pessimism. And so this is in the literature. I mean, it's well known in the literature and has gained a lot of traction, I think, you know, lately, just because of, you know, global events. Of course, it's been with us. The argument is with Afro Pessimism, which is, you know, this field of thought, right, that suggests that there's a historical reality that Blackness is ontologically sort of connected with slaveness, or that there is something in the psyche of people that does something to them about believing this group of people is different, is other, is less than, perhaps. Very consistent, it seems to me. I think, however, that is, like, I think on a global scale, you know, this Afro-pessimism, but consistent in some ways with, say, the work of Raymond Paredes and his classic article in 1977, I think, on the origins of anti-Mexicanism in the United States, which points to religion, which points to culture, which points to the papacy, right? And so when there was this global competition, you know, for dominance between the British and the Spanish, that there was a breeding of othering the other group of people, right? And that somehow seeps into the consciousness of the world, but also of Americana. Afro-pessimism is kind of in that vein as well. And so I would just like, because I want to honor the suggestion of this one viewer, because it is not only heavy, but I think it's borne out, you know, how people see other people, right? I mean, unless, I think, and this is actually part of, I think, the virtue of the Valley, that part of the virtue of the Valley is that even though we may see it as a monolith, that it's mostly like a Hispanic population, you know, the virtue of the Valley is that there's been a lot of you know, and so, you know, I think we can even look at colonial laws that forbade, and even laws in the United States that forbade intermarrying, right? I mean, in the U.S. really up until the 1960s, that was made legal. Well, in La Frontera, in the northern fringes of New Spain, there were people marrying who were of African ancestry, with Native ancestry, with European ancestry, that could not be as monitored. So yeah, the word is miscegenation, right? Mm-hmm. Intermarrying. The intermarrying was so much more common here because people weren't monitoring that, right? So why do you monitor that? Why do you have say laws? Well, because of Afro-pessimism. I mean, there's this big, broad kind of theory that affects people, and so it consistent also with, so many other strains of thought, including why George I. Sanchez would say, Mexican American people, you are not, you are white, right? And because you can gain favor as a result of that through the laws, even Brown versus Board, and Beverly, you have a level of expertise on Brown versus Board because you wrote a dissertation on that. And you saw how it didn't apply to Mexican American children, right? In fact, I have this document from 1941 about Ed Cauchosa Elementary School being integrated, where Rosie Zamora's mother wrote to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, 1941, had Washington communicate with Austin. Austin then communicated with Ed Cauchosa. And they said, Austin, the superintendent of schools in Austin said, or the head of school said, you cannot segregate the Latin child, but you can the Black child.
Yes.
So now, is this part of this whole Afro pessimism that has so gripped us, and that then we need to rehabilitate ourselves, with and through?
And how do we do that? First of all, I'm going to put out a term and a word and an idea that everyone cringe when it's said, and it's called restitution. And you can do that in a variety of ways. Why? Why should we even think about it? In reference to the thought that you just brought about, because I quote and I cite George Sanchez a lot in my dissertation. Why? Because he says, if you are considered white, then you're right. You're okay. You'll get the privileges that you would not get if you were a Mexican American. It will be okay because if you're considered a Mexican American, wow, you're going to speak Spanish. Well, that's why they declared Spanish as a part of Jim Crow. You could not do, because why? In school, children got spanked and hit if they spoke Spanish. So let's talk about this whole idea of enslavement and what that means to an African American and the perception of how others sees it. Well, if I'm considered less than, and if you marry an African American or Black, you're considered Black. My grandfather was white and my grandmother was Native American. My father's Black, my mom, so I'm Black. What happened to my Anglo heritage? But because of the Jim Crow laws and 1/3 drop of blood, then I'm considered an African American. Also, what that says, you're less privileged. You don't get the rights of others. And what happens to other cultures of people as it relates to the African American community is, I don't want to be associated with. Because if I'm associated with an African American, oh, well, I'm not going to get the privileges of others. As I listen to everyone else speak about the lives and how African Americans were here in the Valley first, and when I say that to a lot of my colleagues and friends, they would know, but history bears it out. Documentation and data says that the African American was here first. So we helped build the Rio Grande Valley. As it relates to education, you spoke about Miss Betts and the dissertation that I did, and I've lived here in the Valley over 30 years, so now I consider myself a Valley girl, okay? The study that I spent a lot of time and energy with, because I always say to know my history as an African American is to know your history, whatever that history may be in your culture. I look specifically at the pre-civil rights time, which was 1940 up to 1975, and I received some eye-opener. Pre-civil rights, what happened during that time? Civil rights, and the work that I did we talked about this whole idea of how did education, specifically Brown versus Board, affect the Mexican Americans, because it just was not a white and a black issue. So let's look at some highlights, and this was specifically from Edinburgh. And I have some work that was done throughout the Rio Grande Valley. First, in the mid-1950s, there was not much change. And I think what the Mexican American folks need to really understand, Anglos ran the valley. And how did they do that? In local government. Even though Mexican American teachers and instructors were hired because of the Gilmer-Atkins law. That's how you start getting more Mexican Americans. Salaries went up. They said the teachers had to look like their environment. But beforehand, understand, Anglos ran the county, the school districts, the government. That's the control was there. Blacks left the valley a lot during this time. Why? Because they only had a school to go up to 8th grade. So they had to leave the valley in order to continue to go to school. The Black elementary school students continue to receive their education at the colored school. In the 1960s, the dominance of Anglo leadership in local government and the school district, understand how it happened. They would put 2 Mexican Americans on the city council in the county every year to kind of keep the culture and the people understanding that we have some representation. Now, it did take the Edinburgh School District 8 years after Brown versus Board of Education. 8. Now, understand, in May of 1965, desegregation was outlawed. Segregation, was outlawed. But understand, in 65, it took 6 years after that, specifically the elementary school. Now, understand, the first Mexican-American mayor was elected in 1962. What happened before then? The first Mexican-American mayor in Edinburgh in 62. Also, what was interesting, going back to George Sanchez, Latinos as white people was declared and listed as the identifiable ethnic minority. The Texas Education Agency listed all Hispanic children. You were either white or black. Now, that goes back to what you were saying, Dr. Guajardo. Why? Why was that done? Because Sanchez says, in order to get the benefits, in order to get the money, in order to get the funds, if we declare that we have white students and just black, we'll get more money per student. That's interesting. So there's no data that separates out that ethnicity during that time. Well, wow, how profound is that? I just think that in 1954 to 1965, and that wasn't really changed till 1972. So now let's kind of digest that for a minute. Let's think about why that occurred. And that goes back to your question, Dr. Guajardo. The idea of slavery, Jim Crow for African America, we have never, ever, ever, ever gotten our due of how we have built this country, how we built South Texas, how we built Rio Grande. The Echo Hotel, Melissa Dawson Best invested, paid her money. And let's talk about, let's stop for a moment and talk about Melissa Dawson Betts. Let's bring up the whole idea of, and let's talk about how Brown versus Board of Education, Jim Crow laws. Let's look at the 3 different schools, and I want you to just see what they look like. Let's look at the school that was considered, this school still stands today. It does look a little bit better because they're redoing it and refurbishing it. It's right across the street off of McIntyre, across from the city hall in Edinburgh. And this was considered the white school. Only white students attended this school. And interestingly enough, then we had, and I want you to look at the pictures first, and then I'll give you a little bit more detail. We have the white school, then the next school. This is Stephen F. Austin. Austin was considered the Mexican-American school. This is a more current picture because Austin was burned down in the earlier years, but it was rebuilt. It was still Stephen F. Austin, and this is where the Mexican student attend. That looks pretty nice, doesn't it? Now let's look at George Washington Carver School, and this is a school that was K through 8th grade. And if K through 8th grade, one room, children brought their lunch in, they weren't served at the school. Melissa Dawson Betts was the only teacher from K through 8.
Beverly, can I interrupt you for a second? My apologies here, but can you, for those people who know or who can figure out where this was physically located, can you tell the community where this building was? Because it's not there anymore.
No, it's on the east side of Edinburgh, roundabout about the, right there on the corner, I think it's 16th Street, not too far from Rising Star Baptist Church, but in between 16th and 21st Street on the east side off of Shunier.
And the church is still a functioning church, Rising Star.
Yes, Rising Star Church is still a functioning church. And look at those 3 different buildings. Now, children would get picked up and one bus on each one of those schools. They would make 3 stops, but if they would drive down one street and drop each child off at their home and continue. Now you would think, and then those children would get together and play together. They went to 3 separate schools because there were white children that lived on that street, Black children that lived on the street, as well as Anglo students and a Mexican. They all lived on the same street, but they got on the bus together, but they got dropped off at 3 different places. The school district itself didn't give any funds to the Black school. They didn't cut the grass. They didn't do the maintenance. They didn't do anything. The one person that did everything for this school was one person. And that one person was Melissa Dotson Betts. Do we have the audio? Here's a teacher here. And you have the Jackson family, the Weber family. You had, these were all the students that eventually became teachers. We do have Dr. Luca Hinojosa did befriend Ms. Betts and tried to help her as best that he could. Do we have the audio for Dr. Luca Hinojosa? He does live here now. We don't have the audio right now, but I did interview him as well as Al Ramirez and a whole host of students and colleagues that helped her as much as they could. Of course, remember Jim Crow laws, 65, the school still was going. 65, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, the school was still going because they didn't know what to do with these children. They didn't know how to integrate them. Every school district in the state of Texas were to send a plan to Texas Education Agency and to the governor how they were going to integrate. They did send in their plan, but they never did it. They just didn't know how to do it. It was great on paper, but they actually did not move them until the late 70s. If we can, Mrs. Betts, my heart goes out to her. Once I came to the Valley, and I worked, my first job was in the Edinburgh School District as Instructional Technology Director. Some of the elders of the school district in Edinburgh kept saying, you must, when there was an opportunity to name a school after Mrs. Betts, we looked at a lot. Parthenia Archer out of Harlingen was one that we considered, and a host of other educators, because Ms. Betts wasn't the only one. There were others, but Mrs. Betts was selected, and but something unique about her. She loved her students. Dr. Innerholz has indicated she loves her students. She spent her own money for her students. She spent her own money on supplies and materials. But again, that's what I'm saying to you, how we're saying enough is enough. If we continue to grow a community, grow South Texas, grow the United States, grow, well, restitution. First of all, we should not be looked at as, well, why are you here? Why are you a part of this group? No, because we are a part of this group. We're not thieves and robbers and killers. We're mothers and fathers and educators and principals and teachers, and we're professionals, and we want to be respected that way. Mrs. Betts was not respected, and I have some things to show you how she wasn't respected. Mrs. Betts, she had a Bachelor of Arts in English, a master's degree in education. She had a permanent certificate. She got her master's degree and her bachelor's degree from Texas Southern University. She had all kind of accolades and certifications, but guess what? She got, and I said half, but when I went back, only a third of her salary she received, and she took majority of that to help her students. So no matter what, we're here to, and look, this came exactly, this table 8 came exactly from the Edinburgh School District Board of Directors payroll for all the teachers and their names. Specifically Melissa Dawson Betts. See how they put color? Now, how do you know how the rest of these people, their ethnicity or their race? You don't know. But look at those names. Look at the surnames. You don't see a lot of Hispanic surnames. So again, during that time, 1940 to 1941, you have Hodges and Elliott, and you have Watkins. Well, there's your Robert Vinya. You know, you have a sprinkle, and that's why I want to say to a lot of folk that to know my history is to know your history. You need to understand, and this is the one down at the very, very bottom. Look how much she made. $595, and the others made $1,250, $930. $930 was the minimum. And those that made $930 didn't have a master's degree. You had a master's degree, you got $1,250. Well, she got $495, and they label her as colored. Why? It is important to note that our ethnicity, our race means something to the perceptions of others. When you know who we are, our ethnicity and our race, then it puts a perception in your brain that we are less than, and enough is enough, because we are not less than. We serve in leadership roles also. And look at this was 1939 to 1940. This is an actual document that I found in the school board minutes. And believe me, when I found this, I jumped up and down because so we're not just talking to be talking, all of us. We've done a wealth of research on the impact of the African American in the Rio Grande Valley. And it's important to note that we've made an impact. We should be respected for that impact. We should work together and know, again, that our history is your history. There's no separation there. And when the research that I did came together, it was important to note, and this panel and this group that you have, there's nothing political. Facts are facts. And that's what we brought to you today. Facts are facts. And what do we do with them? This is a picture of a group at Rising Star Church that I've attended on many occasions, that have been in the family of the African American for a long time here in the Valley. So we are putting this together to not for it to be political, but to visit the history that we know to be true, and that we should support each other because it is true. It's not an opportunity to degrade anyone or to be in one group or the other. That's not what we're doing in the process of doing this. So as I close, and as I say that, I think it's important to note that for us, and all the data that we collected, we're just confirming and educating. It's an opportunity to educate. When I first came here, I was figuring out, why am I in the Rio Grande Valley? Of all the places to come to, why the Rio Grande Valley? Well, I think it's an opportunity to educate, Dr. Wahala, to educate how our lives are intertwined. And until we understand that thoroughly, how well our lives are intertwined, and that we need to support each other, and we are a minority of a minority in this United States. And we have been taught divide and conquer. No, sir. We need to come together, all of us, Anglos, whites, Hispanic, Asians, all populations should come together and work together for the betterment, because after all, we're all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friday, for your thoughtful observations and for the history lesson as well. I think also, Roseann, thank you for the history lesson. Alberto, thank you for the history lesson. We have about 10 or 11 minutes before we close here. And so I just want to respond through closing commentary and try to embed some of the observations, comments, through Facebook as best as I can here. But, I want to, in some ways, respond, Dr. Friday, to your observations through my own personal experience. I think that all lives are intersected in so many different ways. I can tell you that as somebody who was born south of the border and then came across to the Elsa, Edcouch, and La Villa area when I was 4 years old, we grew up in a community that was such a loving community, and so when you're growing up, you really don't have the maturity to make sense of who's loving you. There, you're just like hearing the love from people, right? But within that, that there's complexity as you grow up. Like, for example, I had, when I was growing up in Calchosa, some white families that were the most benevolent families, right next to the benevolent Mexican-American families. And all these people were trying to make sense of what it meant to live in a community like Edcouch. Like, I can tell you, Rene's about to put up a map, a 1927 map. This is March the 2nd, 1927, which is actually a historic day in the history of Texas, but also in the history of, and so Rene, if you can put up the map of the city of Elsa, notice how when Elsa was auctioned off, and this is when the Southern Pacific Railroad came through, Elsa was auctioned off, and you look at the legend on the bottom right-hand side, red tags on business lots, it says, white tags on residence lots, and then green tags in the Mexican colony. So this was part of how Elsa was sold less than 100 years ago, in 1927. And so if you look at where it says March the 2nd in big letters, that is the Mexicano neighborhood. The lots are lots smaller than some of the other lots are for business or for what was called residence lots. And in this context, you grow up with people trying to make sense of how to live with each other. I remember Mr. Galloway, who owned a dairy farm, was the one who offered my father and my mother a little home where we could live. It was an old bracero home where we could live while my father worked at the dairy. So was that an act of goodness or not, or what? As a child growing up, you just know that you have a roof over your head. I would become very good friends with Mr. Galloway. My father would conduct an oral history with Mr. Galloway. You know, and so these are people that kind of raise you, right? And if you look at every community across the valley, we have all those intersections. But I do think, Beverly, that one of the things that has not played into the intersections is the understanding that the African-American community, the Black community, is part of that intersectionality. And so when we look at George Floyd, we believe that George Floyd is somewhere else, not here. But actually, George Floyd is here. And we just heard it because Estebanico walked through here, and there were freed slaves that came to this part of the world, both from Mexico and from the United States. That's some serious intersection there. And then they intermarried with the local people. And then people make sense of how to live together. And I happen to think that in the Valley, you know, in spite of the inequities that we may live with, people have figured out how to work together and live together. And there are inequities, to be sure. But you know what? At least we can have this kind of conversation. We can have this kind of conversation where we can have a Black woman, a white woman, and a Mexican-American man speaking about their historical experiences and their research as well. And so I want to thank you for that. And then, Roseann, maybe you can begin your closing comments. And maybe you can speak, Roseann, to what this means, you know, the contextualization of George Floyd through a South Texas perspective. What does this mean in terms of our understanding of how to be better? And so we'll go with you, Roseann, and then Alberto, and then Dr. Friday, you can have the last word. Unmute yourself.
In some of the experiences that I've had interviewing people from the region, myself, you know, I really don't like labeling, but if you would to call I've been referred to as an Anglo or a white. I'm not from the region. I'm interviewing people. They're a little bit skeptical at first. I have to win them over. I have to gain their trust. But one of the things we were speaking about earlier before we started this program was that once I did gain people's trust and to interview them about the history of the Rio Grande Valley and their history and what they experienced and what their parents experienced, what their grandparents experienced. And in some cases, for example, if it was a Mexican-American or Hispanic man who may have been turning 18 in the 60s during the civil rights movement, we had issues down here with the FAR riots, and there's that stigma of being treated like, you know, you're less than. One thing I've learned from being married to my husband, who's a South Texas native, he never ever wanted to be called a minority as a Mexican-American man because he never felt or considered himself less than anything, and minority means less than. And so when I interview these people, and I see the pain in their eyes, and sometimes I still see almost tears welling up that these experiences are so painful to them. And even though decades and decades have gone by, and it's not quite like that extreme anymore, it still kind of exists. And so I feel a passion toward doing this type of research and bringing these wonderful and interesting stories to light so that people can learn more about at least their regional history, and to take pride in themselves and in their community. And then, maybe, as we teach the children in the K through 12 arena, and hey, these things happen down here, and this person was successful, and this person did this, and this person made a difference. And they're learning about these really interesting aspects of the history down here. They're standing up a little straighter, their shoulders are back, they're feeling very proud, and they're going home and talking to their parents and their grandparents about what they're learning. And as an educator, I really feel it's important to treat people the same and to give everybody that opportunity to voice their feelings and not feel bad about how they feel. But I think it's important to instill in our youth, because sometimes old habits are hard to change, but it's important to instill in the children and then into all ages of peoples that we need to treat people with dignity and respect. And when the Webbers and the Jacksons and their peripheral families came down here, they came down with hope, and they came down looking for a refuge, and they found it, and then they were able to flourish and grow and earn and gain that respect in the community. And so regardless of how they identify themselves today, they still were able to accomplish that. And so that's where I would like to go with the research that I do at the university and with the CHAPS program. And, I have been asked to give talks, not just here in the Rio Grande Valley, but outside of the valley as well. And so I'd like to spread that. Maybe it's a little bit purist and maybe it's a little bit naive. And, but I'd like to, at least I can do something about it. And I can start with how I treat people and how I present myself to my students and to the community. And hopefully my research and any publication of or the documentary films that we've done about my research does instill some community pride and does help with this change.
Thank you, Roseann. And so, Alberto, as we ready for your comments, I'll just ask some of the staff members who are posting that maybe they can provide links, Roseann, to some of what you just spoke to, because you produced some very, I think, compelling, historical documents that for viewing and for study. So thank you.
We have our 2 films on YouTube now, A Letter from Roma, which talks about U.S. color troops stationed in Roma just after the end of the U.S. Civil War, and in the rebuilding of the forts and their experiences here. And then the Just a Ferry Ride to Freedom, which talks about my research and the Jacksons and the Weber, and Alberto was part of that project as well.
Thank you. Alberto?
Sure, yeah. So let me, I didn't answer your second part, but I want to end with this. This idea of otherness, this idea of making of otherness, is the hegemonic power playbook. And if we're not in tune with that, we're going to get defeated every time. If you look at, this has been globally, if you look at Edward Said's work on India, the idea of Orientalism, the idea of the way how we look at people in South Africa, the way colonial powers look at Indians, not only in Mexico, but in the United States, and blacks. And sometimes they become exoticized, but they become otherized. And the concept of race sort of makes us do that. It's so powerful that we say, okay, that's a black man, that's a Latino. But we're playing right into the hegemonic power, saying, you know what, they're different than us. So maybe I shouldn't relate to them. But the idea is they are us, no matter who you think of. but it's the power. It's a playbook of colonialization. And as long as we see ourselves as otherness, it's harder to come together. But they do it very well. And it could be George I. Sanchez. One thing we haven't mentioned a little bit in the conversation is Hector P. Garcia was involved in some of these conversations too. And also the way even Latinos say, okay, well, no, es mojado. He's not documented. I'm like, although we're one generation removed from the river, we see them as others, And so this idea of otherness, an idea of separating ourselves from the Black community or the Blackness that sort of been sort of embedded into our society, it's a playbook. It's a playbook. And if we don't read across disciplines and across fronteras and boundaries and countries, I mean, this is the same thing happened to Jews, right? I mean, they were otherized by Hitler. And we need to understand this idea of how this process takes place. It takes an action, and we see it here. And I think you want to bring up that picture you were talking about, Renee. We see it in our own backyard. Here's a picture of when Chapin, or what Edinburgh, many of you guys might not know, is that Edinburgh was actually named Chapin until the father's son, the son of the father who owned Chapin, who the city was named after, got in some trouble, and then it was changed to Edinburgh. But here's a selling of Chapin, and talking about how it's a white community with plentiful of Mexican labor and really no need for blacks. This is a playbook, right? They otherized. We have Mexicanos, we don't need black people. You see this throughout this. So to hear two minority groups being pinned against each other, right? And we talked about privilege earlier, right? And then seeing themselves differently because of the hegemonic power being the white male town owner, right? And so please read Francis Fanon, Albert Memmi, Pekka Hamalea, Edward Said's work, and look at this idea of otherness and creation of exoticization and sort of just hatred towards people that are different, and how that sort of becomes part of the narrative. It becomes part of the narrative in culture, music, art, and it goes across different colonial powers that we see throughout it. Central America, South America, and Cholo, El Indígena Mexico, the indigenous people here in the United States, right? Look at that and understand that this is a playbook. And if we're never able to get to that and understand that, we're never going to be able to unite and work for a cause, because they're working against us. The concept, the ideas, these concepts are working against us. And when we don't see likeness, we're less likely to have sympathy and action in our own lives. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Alberto. Dr. Friday?
Dr. Rahul. Hi. I wanted to say I applaud you all.
Yeah, Beverly, I think that's Dr. David Friday who's jumping in here. So,
yes.
Dr.
Yes,
Friday, how are you?
because this is very, very good.
It's good to hear from you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. Yes, I had to come in because speaking as a medical professional and as an educator as well, that COVID did not discriminate at all. So it affects all of us. That's why we're all linked together. So this is very good that you took the time to put this together.
Well,
Thank you, Dr. Friday. Appreciate it. I just want to, thank Dr. Friday, who's a local physician and a very important member of the community, obviously. And so I think he happens to live with Dr. Friday, Beverly Friday. And so Beverly, you get the last word. So thank you, David, for chiming in. Go ahead, Beverly.
Sure.
Let me just close by, because I started with the idea of Dr. Martin Luther King by saying that it's important that we do not be complicit as a part of the negativity and the divide and conquer, by saying it's important to end with something that he's often said, that we should be judged by the content of our character. And what does that mean to everyone? If we focus on the content of our character, is something that we should hold on to hard and fast. And it's more than just your name, what you stood for, your background. I believe that in context, Dr. King was really talking about our intrinsic values. What are your values in reference to us coming together as a community, as a nation, and that your very nature is what makes you tick. The nature of what you stand for. It's more fiber of your will and the content of who you are. You need to spend some time reading Charles Ogletree, because he talks about the flawed compromise of all deliberate speed. Also, I think George Sanchez, Dr. Tevis was very instrumental in George Tevis' work. He did a lot of work on Mexican American and African American culture and education. It's really important that we take a look at some of this history and know that it is important to know that we focus in on the content of our character and not our individual. We want to celebrate our cultures, of course, but know that we're all African American, Native, we're all Americans. And the respect should be there. I have been a part of, I wake up every morning knowing that I'm Black. And I think it's important to note that I should just know that I'm a human being that's an African American. But society reminds me often that I am Black and African American. When we can get past that, because my skin tone changes, again, the intrinsic value of people, once we can get past that, I think we have made major accomplishment.
Thank you, Dr. Friday. Appreciate your comments. And thank you to all of our panelists. I've learned a great deal from the three of you, and I've also learned a great deal from those who have chimed in through Facebook Live. So I appreciate everybody's participation on this. I would like to just add one final thought here, that when we had our rehearsal yesterday, we went through this process of over an hour of having a conversation about this. And so some of it was similar to what we discussed yesterday, but there was one thought yesterday, I think, that was sort of constructed by the three of you. When I think Alberto began the narrative of George Floyd by saying, he was a Texan. He was from Houston. And then he went to North Carolina, and then he went to Minneapolis. George Floyd went to a place that he thought would be better, a place where he thought he could make a life. This is the story of Nathaniel Jackson. This is the story of the Webbers. This is the story of the runaway slaves from Mexico. This is the story of the runaway slaves from the South. This is the story of Otis Bell. This is the story of people who come to this community. Just like George Floyd, they think that this is a refuge, a place where they can make a life. It is not that dissimilar. And so I think that that's part of how we can also contextualize the life of George Floyd, is that Minneapolis should have been better to him. Yes. And I would like to think that, South Texas has been good to people who have found this as a place to intersect and as a place to make a living.
And that's why the Fridays came here as well, because it was welcoming, an opportunity to serve, an opportunity to work, make a living, live in a community that was welcoming. So I am George Floyd.
Wow. Yeah, I am George Floyd. My family came from Rio Grande Valley and came to this part of the country, because they were seeking opportunities as well. Yes. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Roseann. Thank you, Alberto, for spending some time together with not only, each other here, but with the community and with the world. So, Pam, I'm going to turn it over to you because I think you have some closing observations that may be logistical in nature.
Yes, I'll first off, I just want to resonate what Dr. Friday said yesterday, is this will not be the last time we host something like this. As a history museum, we're here to educate the community about what's going on, our history, and you know, everything that encompasses. So as always, the Sunday Speaker Series online, you can follow us on Facebook. We also have information on our website, www.mosthistory.org, to let you know about upcoming events such as these. And this recording will also be available on Facebook after it is done, and also on the website. So if you would like to share this video with your family and friends, you know, you are more than welcome to. So thank you so much, and we will see everybody soon. All right, bye.
Bye. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Loved it.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.